Hi, this is Peter Teuscher. I'm here with Tobi Demker, back in our usual format, side by side on the screen rather than in your lovely home studio there. Um, Thanks for joining us again for another podcast where we pick a topic, see where the conversation takes us. We talk about personal development, business development, and sometimes a little bit of philosophy. So last time, Tobi, we were there live in your, well, not live for people listening, but for us, it was nice to meet in
Yeah,
person in
yeah,
Sweden. Thanks again for hosting. That was fantastic.
yeah, sure. Yeah, we were just sitting on the sofa just behind me. So now we're back to the old format.
Yeah, exactly. So great visit. And, we talked about experiences. It was a great experience to be in Sweden. I don't know if you had any afterthoughts to our conversation, but I think we covered a lot of ground. So,
Yeah, it's been so much happening, so I haven't really I haven't taken the time to reflect on our chat actually.
yeah, I'm the same. It's been go go go. I mean, I think now that we've been through more than 2 years of non-travel with the type of work that we do, and now it's back to getting on the road. And so it's interesting to think about how when you have a high-paced life, how little time you maybe have to reflect on the things you're experiencing, the things that are going on in your life. So
Mm.
a good.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think that I take time to reflect every day on different things, but it just in this circumstance on the topic at hand, I haven't been thinking so much about that. But yeah, I mean, because we've been speaking so much about the importance of reflection, so I do want to highlight that this is something that I think that at least I try to do very, very frequently, but maybe not on everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also because we saw each other in person, we had so many topics that we, not just the one that we recorded, but we were, we tend to. The reason we do this top podcast is because ever since we worked together, we always found that we had so much to talk about. So
Mm.
so anyway, I totally agree with you. I actually have on my screensaver of my phone, I have this 3 steps from Thich Nhat Hanh, pause, breathe, smile, and
Mm.
I think that's a really good one to sort of center yourself, take a quick
Mm.
moment to reflect. So,
Yeah.
okay, well,
Well,
look,
it's like I just have to plug a little bit my own company name, but my company is LTC,
yeah,
and it stands for Listen, Think, Choose, right? So just
oh,
just
awesome,
listen first and just process that through reflection, and then you can make more of a conscious choice of what you want to do. So it's
absolutely.
very much in the focus of everything I do, I guess.
Oh, that's really good. I think you told me that before, and I'd forgotten. So thanks for the reminder. I think that's a great name.
Thanks.
Great. Well, look, I've picked a topic today. I really want to talk about behavior from a number of different facets. We talked the not the last conversation, but the one we before we talked about identity, and I think um, we identify a lot with certain behaviors. This is the kind of person I'm the kind of person who does this, right?
Mm.
So I think there's an identity aspect. I think that we judge each other a lot on behavior, and
Mm.
so that distinction between who am I and what do I actually do. I think that's a really important one, and really talking a lot about what does behavior tell us, because it's a big element of culture in organizations, and a reflection of our beliefs and our thinking patterns. So I
Mm.
think there's a lot to cover there. So because a lot of times we see, we just the behavior is the result, and we don't think about all the things that are behind it. So I think that's something I'd really like to have a chat with you about. You as your work as a coach, and all the topics we've covered in workshops and trainings. I think it'll be interesting to sort of dive into that a little deeper. So
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it goes back to a lot, as you say, it goes back to a lot of the things that we've been talking about before. And the way the way I immediately start thinking about it, that we've been talking a lot about the things that we see under the waterline. Sort of, if we take the iceberg metaphor, for example, it's like, yeah, identity, who am I, your values, your beliefs, all of these things we've been talking about. But then, yeah, what's the connection with what we see above the waterline, right? All the behaviors, and yeah, how does that reflect the things that are below the waterline, so to say? Right?
Absolutely, and you have the iceberg model for organizations, for businesses, where you can see all the cultural things happen that are happening below the surface that then manifest in the behaviors and the actions, the attitudes you see that are observable. So I think that's a really good one to look at. I often look at behavior as a kind of as part of a feedback loop. So so when you recognize your own behavior or you see it in others, what's that telling you? What feedback is that giving you? Because a lot of people, they respond, they react. They may not even be being proactive. So then you can ask yourself, well, what's driving that? What's driving that behavior? What's driving those actions from those people? And looking at it as a feedback loop. And then when you're looking at it for yourself, thinking also in terms of, what beliefs do I have, or what things am I thinking, or what needs do I have, what's going on internally that's driving me to behave this way? Because sometimes our behavior is a strategy that comes from way in our past, where we developed a strategy. It worked for us back then. It may not work for us now, but it's so entrenched that we continue to repeat it because we're unaware and we're not seeing the feedback. But I think it's really helpful to see behavior not as a means to an end always, but sometimes as a really good feedback loop. So it's the feedback that we're getting in order to recognize, okay, what beliefs do I have that are leading to these behaviors, or what are the thought processes, or what are the feelings and emotions that are driving me to act this way? And we can look at it from many different levels. So from a biological level, sometimes we have instinctual things that we are driven to do. Maybe it's it's things like the mood that we're in, the state that we're in. We're hungry. You've heard the term hangry.
Hangry, I was just gonna say.
and so recognizing on a very fundamental level, maybe it's just I'm not in an optimum state because I haven't had enough sleep. I'm hungry, or the basic needs that we have, or I'm really stressed. So you recognizing, you've heard people go, I'm really sorry. That was so out of character for me. Okay, well, what's that feedback telling you about, are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating right? Are you under too much stress right now? Are you close to a burnout? That's why I think our behavior can be used as some really good feedback for, asking yourself what's leading to this behavior. Is
exactly. Yeah. I kind of, if I state that as a question, like in what way or how. Oh, sorry, I have to reformulate because I'm realizing that I'm looking for a yes and no question. I'm formulating the question as an open question, as is our kind of go to zone, right? Now, but what I'm saying is that when we think about behaviors, yes, it's something that can impact your way of thinking, right? For instance, just a very recent experience. I was watching a tennis game, and this individual started behaving in a way that affected his game. So the behavior, you could argue what comes first, right? If it's the thoughts that affect the behavior, or if it's the behavior that affects the thoughts. But let's just, for the sake of it here, say that the behavior started affecting his thinking, and then his style, and eventually, obviously, he lost the game because of this, right? So in that case, kind of you can see it like how the behaviors affect your way of thinking, your whole posture, the way that you're going to go on with the game. But in a usual setting, I would say that it's the other way around, right? Where you have certain patterns of thinking or certain strategies that you're talking about that is affecting your behavior, and then the behavior is the outcome of what's going on first, right? And I think a very frequent problem or mistake that a lot of us do is when we want to change our behaviors, that we only try to change it on the behavioral level, and that only leads to so much, right? But rather, it's really difficult to see what you're saying, right? So what is bringing out this behavior in me, and how can I affect that, or how can I implement any kind of change to these kind of patterns or ways of thinking, and that can lead to a behavioral kind of change, right? So it's really two different ways of thinking about it.
Mm. Well, and I think that's why I like to see it as a loop, right? It's a feedback loop. So the behavior will reinforce then the belief or the thinking that you've had, or you are already in a bad mood, then you behave in a way that makes other people confrontational, that only worsens your mood, and then it spirals.
Yeah.
So seeing it as a loop is helpful.
Yeah. Sorry. I mean, that's also, when you think about it in what context, is it only personal, or I mean, your patterns of thinking, or your ways of thinking, that's not going to have an effect on others, but your behavior certainly will, right? So it's how that reflects out. So it's both a sort of personal thing, but also very much an interpersonal thing.
Yeah, and that's why when we disconnect from, we don't recognize, we don't reflect on how we're behaving. And there's a disconnect between how we're thinking and feeling, how we think we're being to others, and how we're actually, what we're actually doing. And so, and you become so immersed in the current state that you're in, that you're just not aware enough of how that's affecting other people. That can be one of the consequences. But I mean, that's why I think it's important to recognize not only your own behavior, how it's but also how other people are responding to it, or what consequences is it having for you, and then really going back and looking at, okay, well, what took me there, what brought me there, or in the moment, to take a moment and pause and go, am I in the right state to be taking these actions or taking these choices? So I think when you can recognize that loop in action, it's super helpful in terms of the if you're having behavior that's really not helping you in the moment, or could be detrimental for you, it's a good way to kind of stop, reassess, recognize what's happening. But I think the next place I want to take us to from there. So there's one thing, recognizing your behavior, seeing it as a feedback loop, recognizing where some of that is coming from, and then acknowledging that some of it's coming from certain thinking habits that you have, or certain beliefs that you have, and you can that's where I like to get people to reflect on, well, what's my philosophy? What are the beliefs I've internalized? But the distinction that I think is really important to make is we are not our behaviors. Most people, you judge other people on the way they behave, right? Well, sometimes when you know someone better, you will say, he just had a bad day, or she was just off. It wasn't, that's not really her, right? You might make those kind of comments when you know someone really well, but for the most part, we see the way someone acts, and that's our judgment of them. And years ago, when my brother's children were very small, I was really I really admired his parenting, because he would make a clear distinction when he would when he would scold his kids, or when he would give them, discipline them. He was disciplining the behavior. He would recognize that what's bad is the behavior. It's not you're a bad girl, you're a bad boy. It's no, that behavior is not acceptable, right? It's not you as a person, it's your behavior. And I think making that distinction between your identity and your behaviors is an important one to make.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and speaking of kind of coaching children or being parenting, that's actually something that we talk a lot about in sort of children's sports as well. Like a very frequent way of thinking if you're playing bad at football or hockey, what it is like, oh, I'm so bad, etc. And but then really, for the sake of the kids, really to highlight that, okay, maybe you played bad or you had a bad day on the field, or you made a bad pass or something, but it doesn't say anything about how you are as a person. You are good, right? And actually you can also look at it the other way around, like to sort of to not run away with your ego. Oh, I'm so good, but yes, you're great, but others are also good, and you played really well today, but sort of keeping the ego in check.
Yeah, and that's the problem when you're so over-identified with your behaviors as, the things that you do is who you are, and that's not the case. I mean, it's certainly not, I'm a lot more than a coach or any of the things that I do work-wise. There's a lot more to me than that. Or, I'm not the person who, under stressful circumstances lost my temper or something like that. That's not who I am. That's the behavior that I had in that moment, and I'll take responsibility for it. But I also recognize that's not the whole of who I am. You'll have people calling other people nasty names as if that's a label you put on them. That's their identity. Or I mean, things, when I think about, to stay with the whole children thing, you're lazy, you're all those negative labels that you'll put on people, and then they'll start to live those labels, right? I think if you think about it, how detrimental it is, and I think we've come a long way in society that hopefully this doesn't happen too much, but telling a child they're stupid, or, I mean, I can't imagine how detrimental that is now after the fact, but to using negative labels, and then take that into your self-talk. How many of those I am statements do you make about your behavior, and you put it onto your identity, right? And that can be super detrimental. When I think about, I'm a procrastinator, or I'm a, we talked about Carol Dweck's fixed mindset. We have these ideas about who we are, and it stands in the way of our success and our ability to change.
Yeah, sure.
So the finding a way to disassociate who you are from some of your behaviors. And I think it's healthy to say, oh, that's a bad habit of mine. Yeah, it's just a habit. It's not who you are. It's just a habit, right? Yeah. I think that distinction is really important to make.
Yeah, and I think it's in our role. I mean, now I'm talking as coaches, but also when I think about it, because I actually had a conversation with my son about something like this just a few days ago, and I don't think that before that he could understand the difference between a behavior and a feeling, because we work with it, so we kind of label these different things in different ways. But for him, I don't think he had the capacity to do that yet, because he's young, and it's very difficult to differentiate from, and even for adults, what's a feeling and what's a behavior, and then try to identify what's what and what you can control. It's a very difficult thing to do if you don't get a little help with it. So as parents, we certainly have a really big responsibility to help our children with identifying what's your character and what is your behaviors, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's the benefit of I mean, that was a situation with your son, but also in a coaching situation. I mean, I think of myself and some of the things that I still want to change, or some of the things where I go, man, I can't believe I still do that. I'm, as a coach, I should know better. But that's the thing, from you, the person having the experience. It's sometimes hard to see, right? It's sometimes hard to sort that stuff out. So that's amazing that your son was able to realize that and make that distinction. And I think,
I don't know if he was. I hope so. But
what was the first step?
But it's just But it's. I mean, we work with ourselves. We work with our clients on this. Yeah. But it's also about just parenting or being around any kind of people. Like that, we all need help to distinguish between us.
Yeah, and I think that also comes back to the whole idea of empathy and recognizing that, when we judge someone for their behavior, it's one thing to make them aware that that behavior does not work for me, and I'm not going to allow myself to be treated that way, or even really appreciating the way someone's behaving towards you, and affirming that's what you want. It's still separate from them as a person, right? Just because you like someone's results doesn't mean that them as a person is totally okay. But conversely, just because someone has some bad habits doesn't mean they as a person are bad people, or and that's the thing. We often do judge people just on that one aspect of who they are. And I think that there's some really there's a really good book by Robert Sapolsky. I've mentioned his name before. So he's he has, I think he teaches neurobiology and as well as psychology. I think he's got a few disciplines, but certainly he's written this really interesting book that I read a number of years ago called Behave, where he really lays out all the biological implications of. I believe in a certain degree of free will and choice, right? But I think he leans towards most of our behaviors are out of our control. There are these sequences of biological function that we really don't have any control over. And he, in his book, he's the one, because I brought up before this study that was done on parole judges and how before lunch when they were getting hungry they would have less, they would grant less parole, and then after lunch and then it got worse again as they got tired towards the end of the day. And so it was just one example of how our biological state has so much to do with our behaviors and so on. So I think if anyone wants to read the book, it's really written. He's very academic, but he writes it in a very accessible way for even laymen like myself to understand and be able to read. But I think making that distinction is so important, and recognizing that some of the stuff, some of the ways, it's not about giving up accountability or responsibility for who you are, because I believe we have choice and we have responsibility to take care of getting ourselves in the right state to be the best person we can be. Obviously you and I believe in personal development, personal growth, and I think if you invest the time in that, it'll be, the result will be your behaviors. But I think it's also important to not be too hard on yourself, right? Not to go the other way and just judge yourself solely on the behaviors, and recognize that there are some things that are that you don't have control over, that conditions will, even the best of us under the wrong conditions will lead us to certain outcomes. So I think that thing is also a really important one to think about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, another perspective on it is something that it came up during a workshop that I had last week, and then we were talking about that many of us have kind of fear of public speaking and something, and we talked about some experiences around that. And very often it is like if you actually film yourself, and if you're preparing this and you have the emotions that are going all over the place, right? You're nervous, you might be a bit scared, and some of the reactions to that might be that you start sweating a bit or something. But very often if you film yourself, you see a very calm individual making a very a great impression there. So the behaviors, even though there are those emotions stirring around in your body, your behaviors can still be very sort of composed and look and seem very calm. And I think that's interesting to just that spin on it, to think about how often we might have, we talked about fears, right? That we're how they impact us, but we always have. There's a difference between what's scary and dangerous, right? And facing that fear and sort of holding your behavior in a controllable way. It's difficult to do, but when you see it from someone else's perspective, like you're being recorded or something, you very often see that this is totally fine. and how you can, through just observing your behavior, then you can sort of take control, or not take control, but maybe better manage some of those fears and the emotions that are going around as well. So maybe that's part of the feedback loop that you're talking about here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I'm glad you made that point, because it's so funny. We think that sometimes we think the things that people can see in us are, nobody can tell. You'll think, oh, I was probably totally nervous and so on, and nobody even noticed. And so it's funny. We think that people can see in us more than they can, but also conversely, I think sometimes you think that you've been very clear, or your actions spoke very clearly about what you wanted or what your intentions were, and nobody else picked up on it, right? So you think you're exhibiting a certain behavior to others, and nobody notices, or it wasn't pronounced enough. So I think that's a really good reminder that the way you perceive, and I've done this with sports as well. I mean, a friend of mine, Ulysses, is a really good basketball coach, and he filmed me once on his phone, on my shot, because I was sure I was doing it a certain way, and I've played basketball for a long time, and I hadn't realized I'd developed certain bad habits of movement, right? And that's just a prime example of, in our mind, we think we are behaving a certain way, and then sometimes the perception of other people of that behavior will be completely different, but sometimes you're physically doing something much different than you thought you were. So there's just, in terms of, it's just like the when we look at communication, how complex it is, from what's happening in your brain to what comes out of your mouth to the way it's received on the other side and processed on the other side. Behavior is that same sort of, you've got this thing in your head of what you're trying to do with your body, and then what the final outcome is, what you can't observe it, right? You're stuck within yourself in terms of your perspective, and so it's important to remember and acknowledge that, and that's why getting outside feedback is so helpful, right? Not just relying on your own perception, but getting people you trust to give you honest feedback about things, because you can't see yourself from the outside.
Yeah, and you can only feedback on behaviors because that's the only thing that you can see, right?
Yeah.
And it's so it's only about the behaviors. It's not about anything else that's going on within you. Yeah.
Yeah, and
I agree. I mean, this just this part about filming yourself. I mean, now you can do that, and that's something that we do a lot in workshops as well. But yeah, if you want to improve in anything, in sports or public speaking or things where you're doing something that's visible, get someone to film you when you're doing it. It's it can be a bit daunting, right? Because how am I going to come across? But it's only to yourself, right? But we still very often we have that fear of, I don't want to see what I look like in the situation, right? Because we have this picture of what it might be. But I agree, it's very, very, very helpful. And it's, in our role, if we're facilitating or doing that kind of stuff, if we're being able to get filmed and then watch it later, wow, it's such a learning curve, right?
Well, I tell you, when we started filming this, and it was just because of the program we used to do the podcast also records video, I decided to put it on YouTube. And let me tell you, looking at myself talking is not one of my favorite activities. And but it's interesting to look at and see mannerisms that you have that you didn't realize, the things that you behave. It was one thing to listen to my voice and to get annoyed by things that I repeatedly say, that I, things like, or little, and I'd be ultra critical over things. And now I just kind of, okay, it's just who I am. I'll just let it continue. But also, the physical mannerisms that you're not aware of when you're just talking and don't see yourself. So I think that feedback is really helpful. Obviously, the feedback you get is other people's perceptions. They read into that. Their own biases come into play. But that's why it's great to get. I really believe in the 360 kind of feedback. This is what it ultimately comes down to people's perceptions and how people are impacted by your actions and your behaviors, right? So, but and then I go back to then when you do get that feedback, making that distinction between, well, that's not who you are, so how are you going to get more in line? We did a session last year about how, about values and how values drive behaviors. So certainly that's one part of it. But sometimes you have a bad habit that's not aligned with one of your values, and it still expresses itself, right? So
we can behave in a lot of ways that aren't really in line with our values, and I think we do that very frequently. But if we do that over a sort of extended period of time, then there might be a problem, or problems will arise that you want to address. But I'm sure that we have behaviors that aren't aligned with who we are, so to say, quote unquote, almost every day.
Yeah, and that's why I think when a lot of what you do is contrary to your values, it creates a lot of frustration and unhappiness, right? So that's why when people are working in a job that a lot of the things they have to do are totally in conflict with their actual values, how long can you continue to do that before you? And I think this is why when people make a lot of money doing a job that they're unhappy in, and they tend to find distractions, unhealthy distractions, in order to take them away from those negative feelings that they have, and that's also a feedback loop. So I think making sure that the behavioral habits that you have are in line with who you are, and basically, the values that you have that you want to be living. Because we've talked before about how do you discover your values, and there's lots of them. The thing is, recognizing that your core values that are at the center of your behavior will make you a lot happier and a lot more in line with who you really are.
I just thought as well that we could connect a little bit to what we talked about before when we talked about experiences, how your behaviors also can affect your sort of experiences, right? Because your behaviors is something that you do. So if you by not only reflecting on your behaviors, that's kind of also reflecting on your experiences, but seeking out new experiences is challenging yourself into new kind of behaviors, right? And taking on challenges or behaviors that you haven't really done before. So for me, learning something new or adding a new behavior, actually, when I think about it, sort of developing yourself, it's very much about thinking about how you can add behaviors to yourself, if you want to call it portfolio or personality or whatever it is, right? But adding behaviors that you can sort of they can bring out at different occasions.
Yeah,
I think this is something really interesting, right? To see, okay, this is a behavior that I haven't been demonstrating very much before. I think I have the capability to do it. How can I do that more? In what kind of context could I do this a bit more, right?
Exactly. It requires, I tend to repeat, awareness allows change. But when you become aware of how a certain behavior is, getting in your way or affecting other people in a negative way, it really helps you then go, okay, I want to change this. So having that awareness and being able to reflect on it, and then also having the belief that you can change. And this is where I go back to what I talked about at the beginning, where if we become so identified with something, we throw our hands up and we go, that's just the way I am, right? I am. People will be, and that's why I think this distinction between the growth mindset and the fixed mindset is so important. But, the person that says that, okay, I recognize that and I'm going to change it, right? It's not who I am, I'm going to change it. But then there are people who go, well, that's just who I am. When people will say, well, I'm Italian, I have a hot temper, Really? I don't, I've met a lot of calm Italians, and I don't think that that's genetically, that may be a cultural aspect that, people play upon, but I don't think, obviously I've been to it. I love going to Italy. I love the culture, the language, the food. And there is an element to the culture of this emotionality, the way people talk. They're very expressive, but you have hot-tempered people in every culture. So
You sure do, yeah.
there's a range. So to say that's my culture, that's my identity, is that really helpful? And to throw your hands up and go, well, I just can't help it, right? And that's not the case. And I do have a few. One of the things I want to lead to is, behavior modification. How do we change our behavior? But I think the first step is what we're doing now is understanding and gaining awareness of what's behind that stuff. So when you're so identified with whether it's cultural norms, this is the way one acts in my culture, and then accept that as your identity, even if that's not helping you, I think that's going to be a real roadblock, right?
Yeah, sure.
And that can happen in companies too, right? That's the way we are, and that's kind of the way we are in this company, really. And that's why when I talk about culture change, when I work with people in companies on culture change, we identify what are the current behaviors, what's the culture we want to have, and what new behaviors do we need in order to establish that culture, right? So we directly look at the behaviors that are creating the current culture and what behaviors we need in order to create a new culture. So it can be change on an individual level or in a group or organizational level.
Yeah, sure. And it's going back to the needs, right? Because I think the behaviors are being nurtured by the needs in some way, right? And if we get stuck with a certain set of behaviors, yeah, that's the thing. This is the way that we operate around here. Or you hear these kind of things.
Yep.
Right? But looking back at it, okay, so well, if you had those needs, what other kind of behaviors might serve those needs better or those values better? And then you have a different range of options that you can do more or less, right? So it's really looking at okay, what are the behaviors that we're doing now? What are the behaviors that we want? And just looking at the needs that they are trying to reflect, and then identify, well, what will be most helpful for us? And then because we can't change the needs or the values or whatever is going on sort of below that surface line, but we can change the kind of behaviors that we want to see and demonstrate them. And I think it's the same thing if you're looking at an individual that, yeah, you're behaving in certain ways right now, but well, what other behaviors would make you feel better about yourself or make you feel more productive or whatever it might be that the need is trying to address? Well, okay, well, maybe try to do a little bit more of that instead then. So it's not about taking behaviors away, but it's more about expanding, again, that palette of behaviors that we can choose from.
Yeah, I think
trying to expand on that as well, of course.
Absolutely, and I think that, once you, as a fully developed adult, a lot of times there is no taking taking a new path or adding a behavior. It's usually a replacement, right? With habits. It's most beneficial, or to actually replace a habit rather than to think, okay, sometimes I'll do this and sometimes I'll do that. You'll tend to default back to the thing that's most entrenched in your behavior. So a lot of times it's about behavior. It's about replacing past behaviors. But I think just having that level of awareness and first of all, the willingness to change. I think the number is somewhere around 90 to 95% by the time we're in our mid-30s, our thoughts are habitual, which means our a lot of our actions are also habitual. And so the older you get, the more it feels like it's difficult to change because you've developed so many habits. And so at some point, it's about replacing the habits rather than adding new ones.
Yeah, and also maybe letting go. I just realized, I mean, if we're thinking about, I think I referred a lot to Keegan's stages of adult development, and according to his research, I mean, we kind of, most of us get to what is called the reactive zone, which is perfectly fine, right? I mean, we're well-functioning adults and managers, and there's no problem with it. But then to develop further into the fourth stage, I forgot the terminology here, but it's very few, or there's actually quite small percentage of the population that actually get there, because it can be very painful. You have to let go. Perhaps you have to let go of beliefs and patterns and habits that you have, and that might be painful to yourself, but also to people around you, that you kind of let go of patterns that you've always carried with you, and that can bring with you a lot of discomfort and maybe pain in relations with yourself and others. So it seems like this is a very difficult. It doesn't have to be difficult, of course, but it seems like in a lot of situations that it is difficult to get to that stage.
Yeah, and that's the good point there is, we in coaching, obviously, sometimes when people are having difficulty in change, or they get stuck in behaviors and ways of thinking, there's sometimes especially when it's self-destructive behavior. So when people recognize, I see that I'm doing this thing, I know that it's not good for me, but I tend to go back to it anyway. And then sometimes and I'm sure you've done this as well in coaching, but where you go back and you start to look for what's the hidden benefit, what's the hidden benefit in that negative behavior, so the perfectionist never gets done, right? The hidden benefit there is, well, then I can't be judged, right? If I never get something finished, then you can't judge me on that. Or if I don't try, well, then I never really tried hard. So it's not a reflection of my abilities, because I never really fully tried to be successful. And so you'll see strategies like that in our behavior. And when we start to recognize where that hidden benefit is for us, or we're finding a benefit in the negative, that can be a real eye opener for people. And then when we can let that go, then we can move on and start to adopt those new behaviors.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we can shift. I really wanted to talk about gaining some awareness, that distinction between identity and behavior, and recognizing that a lot of time our behavior is a feedback loop. But if you're ready to, maybe we can shift into the things we can do to start to modify our behavior, or to change some of these habits. So I've got a few things in mind. I think we've both kind of worked on that, whether you were working in organizations. Obviously, in order to change, you need people's behaviors to change, but also for individuals, right? That's where you see the change. That's the evidence that change has happened internally, is when you can see it manifesting externally, right?
Yeah, sure. And I think you touched about something there that we've talked about before as well, but looking at this immunity change. So it's actually what you mentioned in many ways. Like, so what's the hidden benefit, or what's the false assumption, as I like to call it? And again, this goes back to a lot of Keegan's work on this immunity change. But thinking about, okay, so what behavior that you're demonstrating right now, that behavior, what kind of need is that kind of addressing or fulfilling? And then trying to identify, well, what would be a better option for it. So I guess we kind of talked about that, but I think that's a really powerful tool and methodology to work with when it comes to behavioral change. That it's not enough to just address the behavior. You need to address the need and the false assumptions that are driving you, and then to identify new behaviors that can be more productive and constructive to bring this need or this value or these assumptions about life that you're carrying, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of change, there's two things I'd like to talk about today. I'm eager to hear, you know, the kind of tips and tricks and ideas that you have. But you know, although I don't use it I use elements of it in my coaching. But I did my certification in cognitive behavioral therapy, right? And which I think is a really powerful tool. I mean, it's used for people who have PTSD, people with addictions, all kinds of. It's a really helpful therapy. But obviously, as a coach, I don't do therapy, but I find some of the aspects. You know, this is a technique developed by Aaron Beck back in the 60s. He did it together with another psychologist. But anyway, it's a super helpful technique, and really, it's a talk therapy where it helps you gain a new perspective and recognize the beliefs that are getting in your way. So for anybody who's really struggling with changing fundamental things that are really detrimental, whether it's like an eating disorder or a even depression or PTSD or some kind of past trauma, I think CBT is a really, really good methodology. But I think we can learn from it and take little pieces of it to help us talk through things in our lives. So I think sometimes in order to change the external expression, the behavior, it's going internally and looking at, okay, which, as you just said, which false assumptions am I making? What thinking habits are happening? Do I have that lead to certain behaviors? So something happens to me, I process it a certain way, I see it a certain way. Maybe it's always in the negative. It triggers something within me. Maybe it's past trauma. So I really, we're obviously both big proponents of good mental health. And I think, if you're really struggling with a behavior that's extremely detrimental, then highly recommend going to a therapist. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a great one that I recommend, but even just talking it through with someone so you can recognize sort of the mental habits that are leading you to certain behaviors that you feel like are totally out of your control, but really they're just because of processes you've internalized thinking, beliefs, and so on. So I don't know, have you had any experience with that?
I haven't. No, I just have friends that are CBT therapists, and my mom was one as well. So
Perfect.
I've been kind of surrounded by it, but I haven't had any personal experience with that kind of therapy or anything. But a part of our coaching education is to at least get a little bit of acquainted with it. But as you say, I mean, that doesn't mean that I'm a CBT therapist or anything.
No. So anyway, I just wanted to point to people. So if you're, sometimes we are confronted with things that are beyond our ability to help ourselves with. So that's why coaching can be really helpful. But when it goes deeper, when it has, sometimes our behavior is rooted in things that are long in our past, in our childhood, and sometimes in past traumas. So that's where you need to. I really encourage people to seek help and get a professional. And the thing is, I've in the past when there was a time in my life where I thought that going to see a therapist meant that you were mentally ill, and for me, mental illness meant you're
crazy.
Yeah, you're crazy. You're one step removed from insanity. And I think culturally we've made a big shift in that. But I mean, that's the way I saw things in my 20s.
I think it still kind of exists, but we're doing a lot of progress. For sure. But when I was a kid, this was not funny. Like it was. If you needed therapy, your way of thinking that was kind of like, you're crazy, or you should be locked up in an institution or something. Very, very scary stuff.
Yeah. And so then when you recognize that really these are just symptoms of dysfunction on the inside, which, a lot of the behaviors that you have that you consider a negative part of your personality are really just dysfunctions that have come from issues that you haven't resolved. So I think that's the big message that I have for people who are struggling with a certain behavior that they just can't overcome. And sometimes I had last year I had a coaching client came to me with two separate issues, but one was this compulsive thing that that I said, look, I can't. That's not something that we can cover in coaching, and I recommended for him to go to someone else, but. But this is I think an important message that I think I maybe we don't repeat enough is the really deep-seated issues that you have. Personal development is great. There's so many things you can do to help yourself. There are so many great habits you can, but when something is when you discover through this process that there's something much deeper, then get the help that you need. So the other thing that the other person that I love to point to when it comes to change is BJ Fogg, who he's I think he's at Stanford. Anyway, I can't remember which university he's at, but he wrote a book called Tiny Habits. But he also has this really interesting formula. Which basically comes down to, your behavior equals the level of motivation you need, the level of skill, and then the triggers that lead to certain behaviors. So basically he has this graph, this axis. So on the one hand, there's the, how motivated are you? How much do you want to do something, or how much motivation do you need? And then on the other axis, it's how much ability do you need. So there's motivation, ability, and triggers, and so obviously the more ability you need, or the more difficult a task is to do, or a new behavior is to develop, the more motivation you need. So that's why he talks about tiny habits. So if you the smaller the habit you need to change, the less motivation you'll need to do it, and then the easier it'll be in order to implement. And the example that he gives that I love is, he and I wonder if I've already. Sometimes I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's great information. It's worth repeating. But he talks about, well, he gives a few different examples of how he changed his own behavioral habits, but one of them was, every time he had to go to the washroom, he started doing push-ups. So he started with 2 push-ups every time, and then it became 5, and then 10, and eventually I think he was doing like 100 push-ups a day, because every time he went to the washroom, first I can't remember if it was first or after, but the existing habit, or the existing need, he tied a behavior to that, and he made it easy to do, simple, and then he built on that. So he didn't need a lot of motivation. There wasn't a lot of that inner roadblock of getting started. And so it developed into a really positive habit, and he introduced that there were eating habits that he changed. There were a number of different ones, and he's got a great website. I think he's currently got some challenge of 5-day challenge on habit change, and so I think when you're trying to change behaviors, recognizing that they're just habits, and not trying to change yourself overnight, right? So that people who I admire, people who I mean, I've never been a smoker, but someone who has smoked for their adult life and then quit cold turkey, they just stop from one day to the next. That's a really hard way to do things, to have massive change. But look, my dad in Canada, he had a heart attack, and then he tried quitting smoking a bunch of times, and then he had a heart attack, and then he didn't smoke again. Sometimes crisis will help us make those changes, but ideally you don't want to wait for crisis to encourage you to change.
Might be too late. Yeah, for sure. I think we talked. I just realized there's a book that I used to work with by the Heatley brothers. I think Dan and Chip Heatley or something like that. They're also talking about change in that aspect. That I mean, small steps in your habits. That's one way, but also So sort of tweaking your environment about things, or making starting with very small changes, but then also addressing what they call the elephant, right? So what are your beliefs or something? So it's sort of attacking your behaviors from a lot of different points, and then in the end you might have a result. But just doing, as you say, just suddenly changing your behavior completely, in most cases it's a very difficult thing to do, and yeah, not might be very sustainable, so to say.
And when we fail at changing our behavior, it just reaffirms to us that, well, that's just who I am. That's why I can't change, right? And when we try to break off too big a piece of of this this thing that we've developed over, this is something I bring up with people when I'm coaching them, and they get disappointed with their progress, and I ask them, well, how many years have you been practicing this habit, right? And sometimes it'll be like 20, 30 years, and you think that the change is going to happen in a couple of days. And so I think that's, having a degree of patience with yourself in order to adopt some of this change, because I think, there are different ideas about how long it takes to change a habit. But certainly, doing it in a couple of days won't last. I think most people agree that you need somewhere between 26 and 30 days in order to fully integrate a new habit. There are theories that you need longer than that, but
like 21 days, 100 days. There's a lot of different sort of approaches to that.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, it's about, there's prolonged practice, right? And from sports, it's not just going through the motions. It's about sorry, hit my mic. It's about being clear on what the new behavior is. So if in basketball, if I'm trying to improve my jump shot or my free throws or whatever, going in and shooting without consciously thinking about the mechanics isn't, because I may start again practicing it in a way that's not helpful to me, and I think when you translate that into day to day, is what I'm practicing where I want to get to, right? So just being aware that there's the conscious awareness of what it is that you're doing, and are you actually doing the behavior you want to get to, or are you actually getting closer or farther away from where you want to be?
Yeah. So we can't separate this from the objective setting of, well, what is it that you want to happen, right? What is the outcome? What is the purpose of this? But also, what is the motivation that is driving you to exhibit a certain behavior or to change a certain behavior? How strong is that motivation? Is it sort of intrinsic or extrinsic, or we've talked so much about these topics, but it's all kind of interrelated. But it all taps in.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up motivation, though, because so many of our negative behaviors are fear-based. So, one good question to ask yourself, whether it's a belief or a thought, and clearly those lead to behaviors, is what fear is driving this? What am I afraid of? Or what because sometimes fear is just hidden with this need for security, or it'll manifest itself in different ways. But when you come down to the fundamentals, down to the base of it, it's really just some kind of a fear that we have. And so I think that's another good one to be aware of when we're looking at some of our behaviors, because a lot of our behaviors are just a fear response, right?
Yeah, and that's something that I find a lot that I talk about, is to distinguish between the fear and danger. And so a lot of the things that we do, we build up all these kind of scenarios. What's going to happen? It's going to be dangerous. But then when you kind of look at it and scratch the surface, of course it can be scary. A lot of the challenges that we encounter in life, they are very scary. There might be a certain amount of fear in there, but are they dangerous? Usually not. Of course, there are exceptions, but
Yeah.
usually there's no danger whatsoever there. So, being able to identify that, I think that helps me for sure to think about how would I approach the situation.
Yeah. So
And then again, I mean, it becomes like, have you done this? Have you had that experience? Then next time it's not going to be as scary, right? So
yeah.
it's always trying to see how we can develop ourselves or challenge our comfort zone in that sense.
Usually a lot of the danger is in our mind. We're very creative. We have this great imagination, and we often use it to our own detriment, because we can imagine so many dangers and things going wrong, and never stop to evaluate what the likelihood of those are. They just remain present, and so yeah, and then recognizing how those then translate to certain behaviors. So it's one thing to have a worry, a concern, a fear, but until you recognize how that's negatively impacting your behavior, because then that's real world experience. And then all of a sudden, again, back to the feedback loop, now that's confirming your fears, because your fear has driven your behavior, that's created the situation that you didn't want, and that just kind of confirms it back to you, and then your behaviors become entrenched. So anyway, all good points. I hope that raise people's awareness around these things. Should we wrap it up there? Is there something we've missed?
I don't know. I think that's probably good for now. I mean, we're starting to tap into a lot of different topics here as well, which is natural. But I think we've covered a lot of ground, so we can leave it to afterthoughts for next episode.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's all interrelated. So I guess to just kind of sum up, I think what I'd really like people to take away from today is to recognize that you are not your behavior. Your behavior is not your identity. It's a result of, a lot of the beliefs and thinking and practiced behaviors that you have from the past. And if you're struggling with if you're really overwhelmed by certain behaviors that, whether it's addiction or other kind of issues that you have, go to a professional. Really get the help that you need, because it's so liberating once you get through it. I've certainly been through that myself. And then there are little things that you can do, and that's where I point to BJ Fogg's model. If you're trying to change your behaviors, start with changing little habits. Changing these tiny habits will make it a lot easier for you to overcome that sort of that barrier to change. So I think those are the things that I want to leave people with. So.
Well, yeah, just one more thing that I think that we really mentioned as well, that but that other people are not their behaviors either, right? So we judge people on their behaviors all the time, but we really need to look past that, and again, assuming best intentions and seeing the person for what or where he or she is. But the behavior is just the surface, and it doesn't really tell us anything about the person, and we're very quickly to judge others based on that. So
exactly. And if you're interested, if our listeners are interested in more on that that connection to, we are not our behaviors, and a lot of it's biological and so on. Again, Robert Sapolsky's book Behave, I really recommend it. As it's very insightful, and it'll help you understand yourself better and other people, so you stop judging them for some of their behaviors, especially those people close to you that you're trying to have a good relationship with. So, okay, Tobi, thanks for another great conversation. Appreciate that. Thanks everyone for listening again. I hope this was helpful and insightful. And until next time, I'll leave that with you. We'll reflect on it before we start our next one, and look forward to speaking to everyone again soon. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.